I'm going to read from Matthew 28, 11 to 15, and then I am going to read 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8. Would you listen as the Spirit of God brings a word to you? While they were going, follows immediately on the passage that John just read. While they were going, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests everything that had happened. And after the priests had assembled with the elders, they devised a plan to give a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, "You must say that his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story is still told among the Jews to this day. That particular passage was probably written something like 50 or 60 years after the events it describes. This next passage, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8, was probably written something like 17 to 22 years after the events that it describes. Paul says to the people in Corinth, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared also to me." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Oftentimes, an Easter service begins with these words, "He is risen." Okay. All right, it was better than the last time I tried it here. I think you remember that the last time I tried it here, I thought it was a little anemic. Still is, to be honest, but we're getting there. It's a bit of a problem that it's anemic. I don't mean to be too hard on you. It's sort of uncomfortable to, kind of respond like you're trained rabbits or something, but it concerns me that we're not thrilled and excited about the resurrection. Whether or not we really believe it makes a difference to how we live. We're simply going to live differently if we really, in our bones, believe in the resurrection. We're just going to live a different kind of life than if we don't. That's why John Leith, my theology professor, one of the greatest theologians in America in the 20th century, would say to us, if Jesus Christ isn't risen from the dead, let's all go home and earn an honest living. It's at the core of our faith. The core. Do you believe? How strongly do you believe? How does it show up in your life? Those are the questions that I think we need to ask. We live in a world, as I've been saying, that is filled in a scientific, materialistic worldview. What's true, that which can be verified, the way we see here, taste, touch, and smell, what we can verify with experiments. We don't see a whole lot out there beyond the physical world and how it works. That's what's real. And so this materialist worldview is inevitably headed us towards a sense that life is pretty random, that there's not any particular purpose to the world, since randomness is so much a part of what happens. Purposeless and random. Ever wonder about that in your life? You ever walk around and say, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? Because knowing why we're here, knowing what we're doing, has a great deal to do with how we act and how we direct our own lives, the kind of energy we have. And so if you don't see any purpose in your life, if it really isn't in the center, I get that people can become very selfish. And I also get that people can, I don't know, have a certain amount of enlightened self-interest. It doesn't all have to be bad, but it shows in our world, doesn't it? Sometimes we have an empty world where everything seems focused on entertainment. And if it's not about entertainment, then it's usually about polarization, or anger and violence and frustration. The kinds of quick changes that are happening in our lives that are changing the way we live and the way we think and really the way our brains are formed and trained. All the tech explosion and what that's done to undercut the stability of people's mental health. All of that's there. No resurrection. That's the kind of world that seems to emerge. Now the church, does the church believe in the resurrection? It's supposed to, of course. But how much do we really believe in the resurrection, and how do we show it? One of the themes I've been running these last weeks is that the church, in many ways through no fault of its own, is so absorbed in the scientific materialist worldview that we've accepted a great amount of it. We just sort of operate in that world and think in that way because it's embedded in our lives. And so when we say we believe in the resurrection, and we do, in order to do that, we have to kind of posit a God that breaks the laws of nature instead of one that is the author of the laws of nature. A God who reaches in and moves things around to fit God's purposes. A God that we call out to, and then from time to time that God reaches in and does things in our lives that we'd like to have happen. With questionable reliability, let's be honest. Yeah, God seems to live in our lives and move things from one place to another, but it's not something you can count on. You can hope for it, but maybe not count on it. And when you have a God like that, inevitably, the witness of the church begins to get weaker. Do you know what the biggest witness that the Christian church offered in America this week was in our popular world? A huckster selling a Bible, the God Bless America Bible, with no major Christian preacher objecting. It bugs me. That's the witness. When the resurrection is not embedded in our lives, when we're not living because we believe and trust that God is able to bring new life out of death. It's a weak and sometimes pathetic witness in the world. We try, and I'm not blaming this on you. I'm saying it's a large cultural and sociological development over the last decades. You know, it used to be that the idea of science and the idea of religion were not separate. In fact, science used to be called natural theology. You know, it's just another way to understand who God is and God isn't. What happened? Well, I'm going to blame it for the time being on the 30 Years' War. In the 17th century, for 30 years, Protestants and Catholics were fighting and warring and killing one another. And that's when scientism began to emerge as a, reasonable third alternative. Rather than killing each other, let's discover the truth empirically. Let's try and figure this out. Actually, in many ways, I probably would have gone with it, given the way the witness of the church was devolving in the midst of war. But what's interesting about science that now rules is that science can really be seen as the history of the discovery of errors. Really. We're always looking for errors. That's what science does. That's what science tries to figure out. Discover an error. So when we were first in the pandemic, there was apparently some data that suggested we did not need to wear masks. Turned out they discovered that was an error, and so then we needed to wear masks, and people were up in arms. Science doesn't know anything. Science is a process of learning, discovering error, backing off, changing. It's what it's supposed to do, discover things empirically. And good scientists really enjoy that. I listened to a debate at the Museum of American Natural History led by Niels deGrasse Tyson. He had 5 astrophysicists there talking about what we've learned from the James Webb Telescope over the last year. Just as an aside, I thought it was really cool that 3 of them were women. I mean, really, that was just great. But they were talking about how old the universe is. Okay? And there are 2 ways to figure that out. You can figure that out by what's called redshift, by getting a sense of how the oldest stars, as the light comes to us, it gets redder and redder and redder and redder. And so you get a sense, you can extrapolate back as to how old the universe might be that way. Apparently it comes out to about 13.7 billion years. The other way is you can detect the background microwave radiation that theoretically came out of the Big Bang and extrapolate that back, and you discover that apparently the universe is 13.82 billion years old. And what's a few 100,000 friends? But it's really bugging the astrophysicists. It could be that it's just really our measurements are off. That's a possibility. But that wasn't the idea that excited these people. These people were excited by the idea that we are in error with our basic model, that there's something going on that we haven't discovered yet, that the universe works in different ways, and they were pretty thrilled about it. They were looking forward to it being wrong, a discovery of error, so that we could continue forward. And one of them suggested that one explanation for what happened is that the laws of the universe, the way matter interacted, it was different at the very beginning after the Big Bang than it is now. Different, that would mean that the laws of the universe are not so much laws as they are habits, which curiously coheres with an interesting hypothesis put forward by a gentleman named Rupert Sheldrake. Now, at this point, I should tell you, Bruce Springsteen had that line about month-long vacations in the stratosphere. I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes in the stratosphere, and I'm not going to ask you to believe any of this, but what Sheldrake suggests is that really the universe is put together with habits. Habits. And the laws of the universe get tuned and get locked in because as you get into a habit, things just keep going. They keep going until something happens, and then things start to shift. So what does he see? He calls it morphic resonance. And so, for instance, you can train a rat to do a trick in London, several of them, and it turns out that in France and in Australia, rats of the same species will learn that trick much faster than the ones in London because the ones in London have already figured it out. They discovered that if you do a crossword puzzle that's been done by 10,000 people, it's easier to do than it was for the first few people. Something that's resonant, maybe, in the universe around us. It seems to be true of IQ tests. I don't know if you know this, but we've been getting 2 points smarter, 2 or 3 points smarter every year since they put that test in place. Is it really that we're getting smarter? It doesn't seem that way to me. Maybe it's just the test is getting easier because so many people have done it. Here's an interesting one for you. Melting points. Melting points are constants, right? I mean, you can look them up in a book of constants. It's right there on the cover. Okay? But if it's really all habits, then maybe brand new compounds, maybe they would start with one melting point and end with another, and that's happened with aspirin. It was actually done in the late 1800s, but the earliest melting point they have listed comes from 1914, and they compared it to 1996 and several in between. It changed by 8 degrees centigrade. Morphic resonance. Is it true? Not true? I don't know. Then there are a lot of other anomalies, like memory. Where's it stored? The materialists will tell you it's stored in your brain. So then somebody has a stroke and they lose a particular kind of memory. But after a while, the brain seems to heal and they find the memory again. Is the memory really inside our brains, or might it be out there somewhere? It's difficult to say. It's not for us to really know for sure, which actually falls in line with reincarnation studies. The University of Virginia has done some fascinating studies on reincarnation. They've taken kids, usually, who remember a past life and remember it clearly. And then they check, and they find out it coheres with the life. Now, is the kid actually reincarnated or tapping into a memory? Sometimes it's called the Akashic Records. I don't know. It's curious. ESP, extrasensory perception. When spies are trained, I said this before, when they're trained not to stare at the person they're following because that person will know. That's non-local communication from one to another. Russell Targ did experiments years ago. They were funded by the CIA and eventually the Defense Department, where he sent somebody out to a place that nobody knew where he was going to be and had another person get into a meditative state and draw a picture of where the other person had gone. They discovered a downed Russian plane that way at one point. The guy figured out how to draw a crane that was almost exactly the way it was. I mean, it's kind of fascinating stuff. I've done experiments like this with my wife. I've told you about them in the past. It's curious. My point is not that these things are necessarily true. Not trying to convince you. I find them curious. It's not that they're true. It's that it's pretty clear to me that there are many more errors to discover. Too many anomalous data. Too many things are going on that challenge the materialist worldview. It's starting to collapse. It's starting to break under its own weight, and you wonder if maybe now is the moment for natural theology and faith theology to come back together and talk, because while we don't know a whole lot, what we do know seems to me to cohere with the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I've told you in weeks past that I believe in the resurrection. I believe it happened, but I believe that on historical grounds. Jack brought it up in the opening. I read it in 1 Corinthians 15, maybe 17 years after the events. Paul said that 500 people had seen him, many of whom were still alive. Go check. Remember a few weeks ago I talked about that a group of very skeptical scholars who told you that only a few of the words in the gospel that Jesus said, actually Jesus said, and those were in red. Well, those scholars would say that these words in 1 Corinthians were in red for Paul. They're sure of it. And then we have all these interesting descriptions of the resurrection in the Gospels. I mean, in Matthew, he's recognized on the mountain. In Luke, he walks along to Emmaus, and people don't really know who he is until he breaks bread, and then they recognize him, and then he disappears. A couple of times he walked through locked doors and talked to them. He met with them on a beach at one point and suggested they throw their nets on one side of the boat so they could catch a lot of fish, which they did. They didn't seem to recognize him. They may have been a little too far out, of course. all these different visions of what this resurrection was. Now, some people point to that and say, well, that obviously means they made it all up. You know, it should have been consistent. I take the other view. I take the view of my English professor, Betsy, who said if the Bible were any more tidy, I wouldn't believe it. These are stories that came out about a deep mystery that occurred. And whatever happened on that Sunday morning, whatever happened, it began a movement that took over the Roman Empire in 300 years. Something happened that morning. I don't know if we could have videotaped it, but let's call it the resurrection. It was powerful and I believe real, but you know what? If you're sitting here saying, yeah, you're a preacher, you got to say that, you got to believe that, and you question whether it's real, that's actually okay with me. What's more interesting to me is whether you think the story itself coheres with reality. Well, the story itself just makes sense of God's creation and the way things unfold, because I believe it does. We know that evolution unfolds, and as it does, each evolutionary step has three things in common. One, self-organizing systems get more complex with a step up. They transcend the system before and yet include it. And it's always novel. You never see it coming, and boy, does that describe the resurrection stories. More complicated, I mean, walking through doors, vanishing, not being recognized than being recognized. Much more complicated sort of life. It transcended the life of the historical Jesus, clearly. It transcended it because it was still Jesus, but included it so that it was a very different kind of life, and yet it was Jesus, and it was novel. Out of the clear blue sky, nobody saw it coming. And that's the way our creation does, in fact, unfold. It also unfolds from death to new life, which is a movement of love, of agape that gives over and lets go of life, and eros that yearns to draw the next thing together in deeper and more profound harmony. That's the nature of God's power, as we've talked about. It's not coercive. It's creative, moving from death to new life. It also coheres to me the story of the resurrection because it's rational to consider the Trinity. The Trinity. It's rational to talk about the being from which all of this emerges. It's rational to talk about the patterns, the logos, that which forms our creation. And it's rational to talk about the breath of the Spirit that gives it direction and moves it towards an end or a telos. This is rational. And your life and my life is the unfolding of that Spirit, forming us and moving all of it forward into the next beautiful thing, from death to new life, death to new life. And if you really believe that, if you have that in your bones, if you see that this is what creation is about, it's about God's love perfecting and making whole everything around us, well, then you're more apt to cooperate with that resurrection power rather than ignoring it and living a somewhat dull and purposeless life. So what do I mean by cooperating with the resurrection power? A few weeks ago, I was complaining about a purposeless world, listening to athletes talk about their sports. It was around Super Bowl time, and you had quarterbacks saying, football has given me everything. Football is my life. Basketball is my life. I've given everything to it. I heard a very different kind of interview this week with Steph Curry, probably the greatest shooter in basketball. It was interesting. The interviewer asked him, do you ever wonder why people are all excited about basketball? I mean, it's a ball, it's a hoop, what's the deal? And he said, yeah, every once in a while I lay back in bed and I think this is just crazy. How excited people get. This is just nuts. And then he said, but a lot of goods happen in the world because I can put that basketball through that hoop. I have a platform. I can amplify the voice of anybody I see that's doing really good stuff. I can speak for those who can't speak for themselves. I can take 10 seconds out of my day and light up a kid's life. He'll feel joy for a week. And I've done a lot to put things in place so that I can build on that platform and make a difference in this world when the basketball stops bouncing on the floor for me. I do it because of my faith, he said. Because of my faith, that whatever this crazy thing is that I happen to be good at, it is a gift that I have received from my God. And out of gratitude, I know that I am called to use it to make a difference in the world around me. Now that's an aspiration. I'm not saying he lives up to it all the time, but it's an aspiration. And it's an aspiration that every one of us can have. Every single one of us has such a platform. We all have resources. We all have relationships. We can all share whether we're young or whether we're very old. Whether the only thing left to do is to be kind and show joy to the people taking care of us, or whether we can make a turn and think, what am I going to do with my vocational life to make a difference in the world around me? We all have that platform. And to cooperate with the resurrection is to look for ways to look at your life and say, how do I do that? Because in the bottom line, what I got from Steph Curry was, it ain't about me, it's about God. We don't do it because we want good stuff to happen for us. We do it because we're thrilled to be a part of the project. To make something whole, to make something real. That's the power of the resurrection. And so the fundamental question that comes to you and comes to me is, do you believe in a spirit of God that unfolds creation from death to new life? How are you going to show that you believe that that's the case? God's given you a life. It's a gift. It's beautiful. It's hopeful. Because our God is always in the midst of our lives, always perfecting us, always seeking to have us express love and change the world around us. He is risen. He is risen. Thank you. Whatever burden weighs you down, whatever flaw, whatever trauma you've experienced or dream that's been left unfulfilled in your life, know this. You are an expression of the creative love and power of God. You cannot be separated from God's love. God seeks your perfection and not your destruction.